Who created Bitcoin and why? The creator of Bitcoin identified himself as Satoshi Nakamoto, a 37-year-old in Japan. He first posted on the Metzdowd cryptography mailing list on Halloween, Friday, October 31st, 2008 at 1:10 p.m. Eastern Time. He said, "I've been working on a new electronic cash system that's fully peer-to-peer with no trusted third party," unquote. He included a link to his white paper entitled Bitcoin, a peer-to-peer electronic cash system. His goal, to improve e-commerce for buyers and sellers by duplicating the benefits of an in-person cash transaction, but online, by creating a new electronic cash system. There's really no way Satoshi could have ever possibly imagined Bitcoin would be what it is today and where we've come. He was just some guy who chose to remain anonymous, who wanted to improve e-commerce or the online shopping experience by removing some steps in the process. The irony is that improving e-commerce wouldn't crack the list of the top 10 or 20 things Bitcoin is best known for today. Most of what we know or we think we know about Satoshi remains a mystery. His name probably isn't Satoshi Nakamoto because apparently Satoshi Nakamoto is Japan's version of John Doe. It's everyman to them, a generic everyman's name. You can actually read everything he's ever posted and people's responses on a couple different places at a couple different sites. I've combed through this a couple times over the years, and I'm convinced that while Satoshi was clearly a gifted coder and thinker, what Bitcoin has become was probably not his intention. Satoshi's semi-public life only lasted a couple of years before he disappeared outright publicly in 2011. And he really only mentioned 3 ways he hoped to improve e-commerce. 1, allow microtransactions. 2, create irreversible transactions to protect sellers, and enabling escrow mechanisms to help protect buyers, which is similar or why Ethereum created their contracts. People have claimed Satoshi Nakamoto is any of the following people or entities, or even a combination of them, because some people think it was a group of people who made it. The US government, or NSA, or another government agency. Nick Szabo, maybe the most famous or most common person who people think made Bitcoin. He is a computer scientist, legal scholar, and an early digital currency creator. He created something called BitGold back in 1998. Gavin Andresen was a lead developer for Bitcoin for a while. Mike Hearn, he was an early Bitcoin developer who also happened to work for Google. Hal Finney, another early Bitcoin developer, and ran one of the first nodes. Craig Wright, he's a well-educated guy who continues to claim he is Satoshi, even going so far as to take many people to court and companies to prove it. Dorian Prentice Satoshi Nakamoto, yes, that's one person's name. This individual is a physicist, systems engineer, computer engineer, who worked on classified projects, who was outed by Newsweek as Bitcoin's creator, but he denied it. And he blamed it all on a misunderstanding in the interview that he had. Or he could be some other guy or girl or person, or I don't know, who knows? You can actually support, there's evidence to support he could be any of these people, and people have guessed that, or other entities, or even a combination. But we don't know, and probably will never know, who made Bitcoin, who came up with it for sure. We don't even know if that person is alive. For all we know, Satoshi was hit by a bus. I hate to say that, I hope not, but he could have been. Satoshi talked about how Bitcoin, his new electronic cash system's main properties would be preventing double spending by using a peer-to-peer network, that there'd be no human mint or other trusted parties, that there'd be anonymous participants, that new coins will be made from Hashcash style proof of work, or POW, and the proof of work for new coin generation would also power the network and prevent the double spending. He then included an abstract which summarized his 9-page white paper. It highlighted how Bitcoin could avoid some of the burdens that accompany using money through existing financial institutions. And in order to prove to everyone that these transactions hadn't been double spent and that they were unique, effectively making them worthless if they had been, he suggested posting all of the transactions online, available for everyone to see for free. And that included the amount, from where it was sent from, where it was sent to. Of course, it was a little bit de-anonymized because it had a number instead of a person's name. But by doing that, everybody could judge for themselves if the transactions were legitimate or if they were no good, if they were fraudulent. But the network still needed something or someone to run it because a company wasn't selling it. And we know that things don't move unless they're pushed. And so what Satoshi did was offer an incentive. So we know about that, the mining incentive. If you volunteered to donate or use your processing power to solve this puzzle, while also collecting all the transactions within 10 minutes, you'd add them to a chain of all the previous blocks that include those other transactions, and you'd be rewarded with some of these Bitcoin yourself. The idea being that if enough people found value in running Bitcoin, this new network, that you'd want to get some of these Bitcoins for yourself. Then that it'd keep perpetuating the interest, the demand for it, and therefore the price would go up. And eventually it would just continue to run on its own for free and could never be stopped. Well, it took a few days after he explained this to people, but people started responding, not a lot, but a couple. And they pointed out the benefits. They pointed out some of the inherent weaknesses or what they perceived to be weaknesses. Some of the weaknesses they saw were, well, what about the intrinsic value? What actual value does it have? What about inflation? How do you account for inflation with a currency, any currency? What about bandwidth? Would bandwidth be a roadblock when you're uploading and downloading this information? How would the network scale, which we know was an important one? Would it ever be as big or bigger than Visa, since he quoted it? How would it take on the world? How would the world respond? How would governments respond to something like this? How would they ever even allow it to continue? How would it survive attacks? And they gave a couple different examples. But the crazy thing is, it seemed as if Satoshi not only thought of everything, but had a response, a perfect response for almost everything. So when it came to the argument about intrinsic value, Bitcoin has tremendous value. And there's two concrete examples. The first one being it solves the Byzantine generals problem. We already talked about that in a previous video. He said, and I quote, "Bitcoin has a chance to gain a new territory of freedom, at least for a couple years," end quote. As it relates to inflation, he said, as long as, or he didn't say, but I'll summarize for him, as long as usage increased along with the supply decreasing, that inflation would be preventable. Regarding bandwidth, he said the size of the blockchain wouldn't be problematic because hard drives would continue to get bigger and cheaper according to Moore's law, per Moore's law. Regarding scaling, what he said was, well, he either kind of failed here, or he didn't include his full intentions about scaling, or he just estimated wrong, because this is actually a weakness that's still existing today. It doesn't break it, but it's a challenge. As far as taking on the world and how governments would respond, Satoshi assumed that governments wouldn't like it, but he did say that Bitcoin would at least have a head start and that it had a chance to gain at least new territory for a few years. As to how it would respond or defend against attacks, this is what he said. Out of everything Satoshi said that we can publicly find, this is probably my favorite. I love this quote. When I presented it, I was surprised nobody else was concerned about size, though I was also surprised how many issues they argued, and even more surprised that every single one of them was something I had thought of and solved. Every single one of them was something I'd thought of and solved. And if you read it, he says it in like a humble way, not like a, oh, look at me way. Finally, by January 9th, 2009, Satoshi released Bitcoin's full source code, and he was congratulated by the people he had made friends with and talked to on the message board. They talked about how it might be a good idea to maybe get a couple of these Bitcoin in case it ever took off. Little did they know what would actually happen. Throughout 2009, on those message boards, people continued to test and then even improve the Bitcoin code. It was clearly accepted as an open source project in the beginning, and in a surprisingly humble act, Satoshi just continued to allow everyone and anyone with a good idea to apply it.